What's up, buddy? How you doing?
Good, doing all right.
Thank you so much for taking the time today to chat with us and the entire Zion community around identity. I think this is a really interesting topic. We met a couple months ago, and you sent me down this path that now we're emerging at the other side, hopefully in the next couple months to bring something finally to the world. But I want maybe to start with you sharing what is identity online? Like, what does it mean to have an identity? And I think that would be the base layer of adding to our conversation today.
Yeah. So
And
I think
maybe
I
you could
think
tell,
it's
maybe you could tell a little bit of your background too for people that don't know.
okay. Yeah, absolutely. So I sort of went down the same rabbit hole. I think that you probably have been enamored with now in the past few months. Back in like 2012 at Mozilla, I was working at Mozilla, leading developer ecosystem efforts, like trying to pave a path for people to be able to make like richer apps on the web. And one of the things that I really got excited about was maybe the promise back then in looking at Bitcoin that we had the ability for the first time really to have identifiers that we owned that weren't just simple key pairs. And the reason for that was like, we want IDs that aren't a corporation's IDs, like email addresses or these usernames. So sort of the foundation of apps, right? If you wanted to have some decentralized apps that we at that time were exploring as browser edition called Firefox Handshake, the first piece is, do you own the account, right? And apps of today, you don't. You don't really own the account. It's granted to you. So when I saw Bitcoin in 2011, I was like, oh yeah, it's a really cool way to do public key infrastructure. It's kind of the first like large scale public key infrastructure that's centralized. And that's kind of what sent me down this whole like rabbit hole for identity. And ever since then, I left Mozilla to go actually build the technology at Microsoft. And from there, just recently, about a year ago, left for Block to kind of go build out the app piece of it after kind of doing more of the foundational identity pieces.
So when people talk about identity, I know that we know this really well, but if this is like a layman's person, someone that doesn't understand, what does that mean? Like, what is the base layer of identity in traditional applications mean?
Yeah, so identity is sort of the all-encompassing word that just means everything about you, right? Like some people fall into the trap of thinking identity means like just governmental paperwork or something, right? And that's just one tiny piece of your identity. I would posit to you that your identity is pretty much everything you type into apps and that people are typing in about you, because your identity is anything in the world that defines you, right? What people say about you, what they write about you. Do you have a Wikipedia page? All of those things make up your identity. So identity is composed into two main parts, right? Under that umbrella of identity. And it doesn't always mean personally identifiable. I think we want to get that across. Like just because you're saying I'm using identity doesn't mean you're saying I'm declaring who I am in the real world. It just means you have some persona out there. So under the umbrella of identity, there's really two key parts. There's identifiers, which are these digital references. Email, like I said, is a good example of a current system identifier, or like your app name on Twitter is another identifier. And then there's all the data associated with your identity that kind of like defines you as a person. And the cool thing about identity is you don't have to present the same identity to everyone, right? You have one identity in the world. You're one person, but you might want to only reflect maybe, a portion of that with others, right? Maybe you want to have a pseudonymous identifier that you use, like some people do on Twitter, and you only want to disclose things about a certain topic, right? And keep all of your other actual personal life and maybe other identifiers and data separate, so you're not correlated. And that's a choice you have, right? So identity doesn't mean you're like giving everyone all of yourself and like making yourself traceable everywhere. It just means you're sharing a portion of who you are in as private a way as you want.
You think about identity on social media, walk through that process because I've talked about this before where you're logging in to Facebook, you're using a Gmail account. So walk me through that process, how even the identity ownership on these networks where they're kind of it's like your digital world, you don't own. So like walk through the base layer that we have now and then kind of talking about what we're trying to do together with DIDs and stuff like that.
Yeah. So the very base of all identity is identifiers. Without owning your identifiers, you really don't own anything, right? Because everything is rooted in an identifier. And like I said, it could be one that's very personally identifiable or one that's very pseudonymous. But the reason for that is like just think about Twitter, for example, right? You have DMs, you have these people that follow you, and all these things are really a relationship type connections, right? And what they're connecting to is your identifier. When someone follows you on Twitter, it's not just like random, they're following your ID to see content that you publish from it. If you change your ID tomorrow, right, like, and there wasn't some mapping there, like let's just say you started using a different identifier tomorrow, that you had all these connections on one, you would lose it, right? If they suspended you or removed your account, all those connections you lose because they own the point of connection with others, and that's your identifier. So the principal difference between a system like Twitter and Zion, decentralized social media effort, is that at the very base, you are in control of the pseudonymous ID that you're using with others. So, if Zion builds a system that has Twitter-like features like follows and things of that nature, which most people want to do, you're going to own those connections. So Zion, as a company, can't do anything through this protocol to remove those from you. I think that's a really important thing as we move forward in like the digital world, because more and more serious things are being tied to digital identity. And if you don't control it, it's kind of like, people can kind of unperson you in a way. And I think it's getting to be more and more of a threat as society digitizes.
And when you were thinking about this a few years ago, like where did the vision of it come? Because you've been working on this problem for, I don't know, 10 years? Is that long? Like almost that long? Like what's been the passion that drove this for you to like get so like make digital identity so important as we transition to talking a little bit about DWNs and Web 5?
Yeah, so I've been a libertarian for most of my adult life. When I was about 22, I suppose, is when I really like crystallized for me. I was always pretty liberty minded, but I really became a libertarian in a way that I understood, fully around then. And I always sort of believe that people should be in ownership of not just the property and things of that nature in the physical world, but that looking at digital life, even in 2020, in 2012, when we first started this, it was already sort of nearing a point where you could see that your digital persona, your digital representation of yourself is worth just as much, right, in many respects as physical possessions. And so from that perspective, my goal at the time was like, let's make sure that we give the same defense and protection to our digital selves as we afford to in the real world. The things we believe in, free speech, self-ownership, those sorts of things. And so that was really the driving desire, and that's why I haven't stopped for these 10 years, is because until we solve this problem, I think the magnitude near the magnitude and closeness of the threat is only going to grow, right? And you see it every day. You see authoritarian regimes do it. You see Western democratic governments do it. And I just fundamentally think it's a digital human right to own your identity.
Now let's talk about, so we've talked about the base layer. So the idea here is that kind of for the first time, a user, a creator, an influencer, and again, I don't know if this is being done at scale currently somewhere else, but like, so you own your base layer identity. That's the first part of this process. What happens next? So we're giving people a DID, right? And I think we've decided to use Ion, which you spent a lot of time building at Microsoft. Is that correct?
Yeah. So we built Ion as a layer 2 on Bitcoin. What it allows you to do is have pseudonymous identifiers. They're just big, kind of ugly strings, and you kind of own them like you own a Bitcoin wallet, right? There's keys that back it. The interesting thing is with this versus, say, PGP or a previous system that attempted to be a PKI system, is that
What's
you're not bound.
PKI what's a
So
PKI?
a public key infrastructure, meaning
Okay.
some infrastructure where you take a public key and maybe you look up some other data. Typically, systems of the past, that was always bound to one key, right? So you better not lose it. And there was no real global universal agreement on state of what was behind it. So what Bitcoin did is actually for the first time created a public key infrastructure where you could roll keys, which is interesting, right? Like it just is, it actually solved that problem that the digital identity sphere has had for coming up on 50 years, maybe.
And
The
what does that
Holy
mean to
Grail,
roll keys? Yeah, what does that mean to roll
yeah.
keys?
So the problem with using just a public key as your identifier, right, is that let's say you wanted to associate a different type of key, right? Like there's SecP236K1 is the keys in Bitcoin, but there's lots of other reasons you might want to use other keys for other things. Like a lot of companies still use RSA for certain things. Edwards curve ED25519 is used for lots of different like sort of advanced cryptographic stuff. So you might want to use multiple keys. It's kind of hard to do when you have just one key. And then if you ever think that a crypto system is nearing compromise or something happens to it, you might want to roll off of the key, right? So if you're using a public key as your ID, you can't ever leave it, right? You don't have a stable ID that you can switch to a different private key with because they're inextricably linked. So when I say rolling keys, I mean a DID allows you to have a stable ID that you might maintain the same exact ID over 50 years, but you can switch out crypto systems underneath it, right? So that if you need to use, say, give a quick example, like in 10, 15 years, if quantum computing does threaten the current elliptic curve type keys, you might want to switch to something, one of those NIST curve keys that they just standardized on, like lattice encryption. So you want to switch from maybe a vulnerable crypto system to a newer one. And that's something you can do if you have a system like that.
And when you talk about this, like, do you see regular people thinking about these types of problems, or like the education piece? Because a lot of this stuff is even over my head. I'm trying to like, and I love it. I nerd out on it. But for the regular person or the regular creator, why should they care about these things? Like, why should they care about the private key and how the encryption works and all these things? Like, where's the value piece of ownership there?
I think the value is the fact that owning all your connections, right? The ability to do that durably over time and have the guarantees that your ID, the thing you primarily use to interface with potentially hundreds of thousands, millions of people, if you're one of these like big influencers, that is honestly your value, right? Your life's work sometimes, right? And to lose that at the snap of a finger because some, I don't know, person sitting behind a computer thousands of miles away like doesn't like one of your posts or something, it's just ridiculous to me. And so I would say that while they're probably not concerned with the underlying nerd stuff, I think people are growing more concerned. I mean, they unperson millions of people a year, these large tech companies. So every time they do that, what they're doing is they're minting a new customer of decentralized identity. I think that that's what they're helping us in a way, right? By sort of ostracizing people en masse, they send them to the only place that they can go, which is a system that doesn't do that.
Sure. And so now we're transitioning the conversation from, okay, we are helping people get a decentralized identifier that they own through a key, like a private key that can open a lock. Now,
Yeah.
talk a little bit about what's the next step in that, because I understand the framework of, okay, you're going to have this identifier. Now people are going to try to associate your identity with this identifier if you're a really big influencer. What's the next step in that process? Like, what is the thing needed? And this might be now kind of what are you focusing now at Block?
Yeah, absolutely. So identifiers on their own aren't super interesting. It's an ID. It's a thing you can prove ownership of because you can sign a Bitcoin key, or you can sign a Bitcoin signature. I'm sorry, you can sign a private key signature over it and prove that you own the ID. But that's like limited use, right? I guess you could log into a website, right, if you had an integration. But there's no content to it. The ID doesn't have any provenance. Like no one's trusts it implicitly. They're all kind of born naked in the sense that it's just a key pair and an ID. So the two things you kind of have to add to the equation to realize value. One is verifiable credentials, which when I say it, it kind of sounds weirdly governmental, but really all it is just a signing format for assertions, like assertions someone might make, right? So an assertion being, a diploma from a school, they could say, this ID that you presented, you're a graduate, and we're going to give you a digital representation of the diploma, or we're going to
Let,
give
let's
you,
frame let's let's frame that real quick. So and let's build a proxy. So In the example that you just mentioned, which is a diploma, the way that we can reference a DID to a verifiable credential, maybe a good way to do this is like your driver's license to your diploma from a university. Those two match because the university has to see your potentially your driver's license or your social security number. They're like, okay, I'm going to give you this diploma. That's what happens in the real world. And now we're proxying that digitally.
Yeah, any type of statement that another person or entity wants to make about you, you can receive in digital form. So a driver's license is a form of verifiable credential. A diploma is a form of verifiable credential. Maybe one of your first verifiable credentials might be something like a driver's license. Who knows, right? You don't have to show a driver's license though. If you showed a physical driver's license to a school, and they happen to know it was you in their records, and then later said, "Hey, give us a DID and we'll give you a digital diploma." You could do that, and you could just have proof now that you could put on LinkedIn or your website, and anyone who found it could then pick it up and say, "Wow, okay, cool. This was actually given to you by whatever university said you received a degree." So it's the first time
Got
really we've had the ability to create trust that was independently verifiable in a standard way on the internet, and that's what the internet
it.
has been missing.
Yeah, and you talk about standards. Like, I want to harp on this because there was a pretty remarkable thing that happened a couple weeks ago with DIDs, and this is really predominantly your work. What happened with I think this was W3C, and maybe describe who they are and why they finally accepted DIDs as an identity standard and what that means for the world. Like, why is that so important?
Yeah, so the DID work, decentralized identifier specification, a means to declare a standard for how we can do DIDs, started around 2015 with a group called Rebooting Web of Trust. Christopher Allen runs that group. He formerly worked at Blockstream. He's been in the Bitcoin community.
He's so smart. I love that guy. I've had a few phone calls with that the guy. He's a genius.
Yeah, Chris is a great guy, and there was a lot of other people there, Manu, Sporny, and Drummond Reed, other people that have been in the digital identity community for a long time. They kind of noticed the need, and I appeared on the scene around the same time, and we started an effort in W3C, which is the body that defines most standards that make it into your browser. So basically,
So
the
so
reason why a
let's
web
let's
page.
let's talk
Sorry.
let's talk about that because I don't think people really realize that a lot of the things we do on the internet has a set of guidelines that people follow. I don't think people really know that. So this governing body, which is W3C, they define some of the things that happen that like we're in a browser right now. Most people are observing this through a browser. They define how stuff works.
Yeah, so W3C is a standards body that is like a membership group. You can join it if you're a company. The price depends on like how big of a company it is. That's usually how this stuff is set up. And they essentially you meet with these companies, browser vendors being like some of the primaries, and you codify standards. And those standards are specifications that anyone can freely implement without fear of patent stuff attached to it to advance, technologies. And typically, W3C has been focused on the set of technologies that pertain to browsers. So things like, all the things that define how images and HTML and CSS, the styling language of the web that like makes web pages look a certain way. All those things are standards individually in W3C, and the browser vendors meet with other companies, work on them, codify them, and then they all implement the same standard. And that's why you can look at a web page on Chrome and like Firefox and still see the same thing because they're implementing the same standards.
So they added this identity layer called DIDs to their standard as a new identifier on the browser. Explain like
So
why is it so impactful what they did? Because it looked like it was like such a big deal. Why was it so important?
So I think there's phases to this. One, we're not at the end of the road. The first phase was, hey, let's just get the spec together. That took nearly 4 years, right? So we kind of got the spec together. Then last year, we started gotten the stage where we thought we were done. We were like, okay, this thing's pretty well fleshed out, and we're ready to move it out of just this working group stage, which is kind of the iterative weekly meeting work type stuff, to proceeding towards a recommendation. And a recommendation in W3C and many other bodies is when the body comes together as a whole and says, yeah, this thing is polished. It has like the right security sections and all the different things you need to box check to be complete. And about a year ago, we started that process. And the funny thing is, most of the browser vendors, except for Microsoft, hadn't been actively participating in the DID work. They actually sat it out at the very beginning. They kind of said, "Okay, we're not gonna do this." Now, some of them stand to potentially lose, big from DIDs, right? They may not own your identity anymore, right? And some of them
Who
love their walled
like
gardens.
who exact like give an example of that. So who right now owns identity that this would be a really bad thing for the users to own it, not a centralized company?
It depends how they react and how they adapt. But if they became allergic to it, you've got like the Facebook, Google, Apples of the world who typically enjoy their walled gardens and their ownership of the account nature of the centralized web. And so
Yeah.
from that, they get to see where you log in and they get kind of intermediate your experiences. And so it could present them an issue. Now, I would argue that a lot of those companies do have a lot of value added services. So even if you had a DID, you probably would give them permission to do a lot of stuff because you just want to use their stuff potentially.
Yeah.
But if they reacted allergically to it, you could understand why not owning people's accounts is it.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an interesting question because if you're a person that uses the internet and you want to go log into a new service, you sometimes see these like login with Facebook buttons. And what's happening there, and just maybe correct me if I'm wrong, is that Facebook owns your identity. And now, because you've created an account with Facebook, they go to other developers and other businesses and say, hey, use our login function, give us all the data of what people do on your website, and we'll give you this service for free, which is login with Facebook. And so you don't have to worry about identity. So they have a lot to lose here because all of a sudden the user can now own their own identity. And instead of having Facebook own it and own everything that you do everywhere across the web and they track everything you do,
Mhm.
now you own it for the first time. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. At the most fundamental level, even before we start talking about content you post and owning that, just your ID, people might not know this, we're talking to a mixed audience, but whenever you log in using one of these social accounts, what's happening is like they're essentially provisioning this token, this like little piece of data that's going around and sticks in your browser and like it refreshes every once in a while. And all of those calls, your browser's calling back in certain intervals, and when you obviously log in and connect to a news site or app, to like say Facebook, and they're made aware of this. So they have like your full graph, like they know that this identifier touches all these websites and apps, and they kind of have this
They know
view of you.
everything.
Yeah.
They know everything. It's really scary, right? Like if you actually think about it, like when we had lunch, what was it, February at this point, and you told me all this stuff, I did not realize the impact of how much decentralized companies own everything that you do and the downstream results of that, right? Like there's 1.5 billion Gmail accounts, Gmail emails. There's probably more. Maybe the number's outdated, but imagine all the things you log into with Gmail, your bank, um, probably everything you buy in cryptocurrencies, like everything you log into in all these different places, they own. It's actually a mind-blowing thing to think about that you don't own yourself online.
Yeah, and that graph is actually super powerful too. I mean, I don't mean to, freak people out or whatever, but knowing everywhere that you're connected to, by virtue of your logins and your interactions, at least at the top level, that could afford you like what happens in the future if legal loopholes are found and your insurance company goes to one of these companies and says, "Hey, let me see how healthy this person is." We could put a profile pretty easily over someone's like traffic and their logins to different things and probably say this person's more likely to be someone I give a high rate to, and this person's more likely to be someone I give a low rate to based on that profile. And that's something that you might not think, hey, I'm going on Facebook and this is going to affect my like healthcare. I'm going on Facebook and this is going to affect my rate for auto insurance, right? And that's creepy to me.
It's the privacy of our lives seems to have been completely like privacy has gone away in so many ways. Like and other companies own everything that we do, and yeah, it's just yeah, it's a rabbit hole in itself. So we're
Yeah.
at identifiers. Now we're diving deep into how do these identifiers create something that people can use, and what is that? new idea of a pattern.
Yeah, so you don't need too much. The interesting thing about social media, and so people, you'll hear people in like sort of big tech or been in identity for a while, they'll say, well, what use are IDs without like a government stamp of approval for a credential of a driver's license or something? And I think it's sort of a old school view. It's a very legacy identity view. Like you only have identity because you have a government document, and that's actually not true, right? And we see that all the time on Twitter. Like I know a bunch of accounts on Twitter that don't have their profile picture, the pseudonymous ID, and they can still make connections with tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people. And you don't actually know who they are. So you don't have to have anything but an ID and the ability to publish content to be effective in social media, technically, right? I don't go on anyone's account and say, let me see your driver's license before I'll follow you on Twitter, right? Just not what happens. I just like their content and what they put out, and I say, great, I'll follow you. So the setup is there as long as you have an ID and a means of publication that are both decentralized. You can create decentralized social networking where I can start following people and reading their posts without that man in the middle that is either going to keep my connections or maybe prevent me from seeing their content. So the next piece that we add to DIDs is these things called decentralized web nodes. It's something we're working on right now. It's under heavy development, but kind of just think about it as like a personal data storage and like relay box for you. You could run on your local devices. You could have a host run one too. You could run one like, always on your desktop machine at home, whatever you want. Your degree of decentralization is your choice. And your DID links to those instances of that thing, and you publish content to them. So like, let's say I wanted to write like the equivalent of a tweet or a Zion post, right? I would write that up and I would stick it in my decentralized web node. And anyone who found my DID, on the ground, right, proverbially speaking, could look up the DID, find a link to my DWeb nodes, and then get my posts, right, like read them. And that allows me to post from an ID that I own, that no company owns, and from sort of this data store that itself is decentralized, that no one can stand in the way of if I don't want them to. And so that's pretty powerful, right? So we have the identity, and we have the content, and we have the interdiction resistance of both of those that are key.
So let's dive a little bit deep into that, because what most people have as a proxy in their mind is this, they log into their phone, they grab their phone, they open an application, and they're like, okay, cool, here is YouTube, and I just go to YouTube and I do that. In this new world, how does that change for the individual person? How does that change for the user? And why is it so important for the user that this changes?
Yeah, so there's a number of ways it changes. The actual app model changes a little bit. So right now, when you like write a post up on any of these sites, right, you type it in, you upload some photos, whatever you're doing, and then you send it off to their centralized servers, and they store it in their database and make an experience out of it. In the future, I think the model that we'll see with DWeb nodes and some of this infrastructure that you're helping to build is I will put that post in my DWeb node, and then aggregator services will come by, right? And these can be decentralized protocols themselves, and pick that data up from each user and kind of form it up, and so you can get this big aggregated feed. You can always go direct. You can always go right to the person's DWeb nodes and pick up their posts directly. But you'll probably see something like a Zion community server or a decentralized community server that says, okay, great, you register your DID with me, and then I'll come and like grab your posts so that it's very efficient. So when you open up an app in the future, it might not be this heavyweight app that has its own servers in the background and all this stuff. It might actually be an app that's mostly just like UI, right? They're just shipping you a UI to visualize data that other people are posting in this decentralized network. And that's cool, right? As a developer, I don't want to maintain a bunch of huge, server infrastructure and all this stuff. I don't want to do that. I'd rather write an app that was just sort of a UI to the experience that I want to provide you.
Got it. So now this open architecture is creating a pattern for applications to get developed. So now you own your identity, you own where the data is now stored. So the stuff that you post, you most importantly own the connections. Now, what does this new world look like? So you have all these stacks. Let's dive deep into what you guys announced in June at Consensus, some of the work you're doing at Block, the vision around that. Like, what is Web 5?
Yeah. So it's kind of a cheeky term, I suppose, given all the Web3 stuff. But Web5, the reason we called it that was we wanted to create separation of ideas, right? Of ideas, of approaches, which are fundamentally different than the approaches to the sort of bodies of technology and applications that we talked about so far. In the traditional Web3 approach, typically it's very heavy on blockchain, use, like, there, any goes all the way up to people being crazy saying, let's post tweets on a tweet blockchain and all this
Yeah, yeah.
nonsense, right?
And why this? I want to dive into this real quick before we continue. Like, why is that stupid? Like, why is posting content to a blockchain stupid?
Well, I mean, if you never want something, let's advertise the features of the blockchain. Maybe people can decide if they think this sounds great. It's super expensive. It's generally pretty slow. It's never going to feel like an app, an app used today. Like I said, super expensive, slow. You can never delete it. So I hope you don't tweet, you had some drinks or something, maybe on a Friday. Don't tweet to the tweet blockchain because that's no plausible deniability there. So it has all these characteristics that sort of make it maybe the worst place to put personal data. It's also highly inefficient and unnecessary because of the things I mentioned. So Web3 tends to skew that direction. The reason I think they skew that direction, to be quite honest, and I don't want to paint 99, 100% of the people this way, but the vast majority, let's be honest, are sort of pumping a token where they're pumping the use of an L1 blockchain that they have, invested interest in. And the reason they don't want to do it in system off blockchain is because, well, if you don't use their blockchain or their token, then they don't get to make money off,
Yeah. So
right?
let's talk a little bit about that. I made a video yesterday about why Zion will never have a token, at least while I'm running it. Um, so why? So you have people out there that are these innovators, quote unquote, that they're building these blockchains. A blockchain is effectively like a shared database where maybe that's kind of a right. You want to just quickly describe what a
Shared
blockchain is for
database you
somebody?
can never delete things from. Yeah, I mean, a shared database that is incredibly slow and super, super expensive. I mean, we're
And
talking
then
like maybe millions of times more expensive than necessary. Yeah.
and then every time you have to work on it, you have to like pay this native currency of the blockchain, correct? Like Solana, you use Sol. Ethereum,
Correct.
you use Ether. Yeah, like you're using the thing that they've essentially created out of nothing
Mhm.
to transact on it. And this thing is actually traded in exchanges as well, right? They're traded on open public
Mhm.
markets. Um,
Yeah.
why is that a bad approach to building a decentralized application infrastructure? And I want this to maybe be like a real like let's dive into the differences on why this approach is better than Solana and Ethereum. Because I guess
Yeah.
those are the two
So
biggest right now.
some practical ones, right? Yeah, you're going to have to, there's like the basic economic principles, right? Most of the world wants to move, and this is a natural human thing, move to one medium of exchange, right? So people will talk about utility tokens. Like, I want to do a utility token. I added so much utility to this. They don't really add utility, right? I'm just paying to store data in this big, expensive database called the blockchain. Turns out well, why would you even need more than one token? You don't really, right? So at the end of the day, you could argue like, well, we kind of only would need one of those anyway. But imagine what I like to do for an analogy of this, right? Instead of every app having its token and that somehow seeming same, imagine you had a token for milk and a token for bread and for maybe some produce, right? You had to get your produce tokens for every different fruit. And how wonderful that would be, right? To have to go and take your common medium exchange, which is actually an economic efficiency that simplifies life, and say, oh no, I gotta go by script for all these different things, and then I hold that, and then oh, I bought too many milk tokens, so now I need to do an exchange, and this is where they make their money, these token people. I gotta exchange milk for bread tokens. Well, who's standing in the way of that transfer, that exchange of tokens? It's someone that's operating an exchange or has a vested interest in the volume and being able to play that economic transfer. So not
This is
only
a
is it
brilliant
cumbersome and annoying,
analogy. This is a
yeah,
brilliant analogy here. So the
not only is it
concept,
cumbersome, go ahead, sorry.
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Not only is it cumbersome from the user's UX perspective, it just bleeds you of money, basically, that's unnecessary.
So right now, the way these systems are working is you want to go do something on Solana. You have to buy Sol and then you have to do stuff on it. Then if you want to do something on Ethereum, so like one is bread, one is milk. And now let's go to the one that's agnostic, right? So Web5 being built on Bitcoin. So let's do the proxy. Let's just do a one-to-one proxy.
Yeah,
Web5,
absolutely.
Bitcoin, and Solana.
Hmm.
Let's go head to head between these two things because a lot of people argue. I mean, they're in my face all the time. Well, why don't you build this on this? There's so many developers. There's this developer ecosystem. They have so many of this. Why? Why is this a better technical approach?
Yeah, so when one of the things I'll say just about like there's so many developers. I don't know if there's so many developers that are actually there to do real utility things. If you see most of the volume, if you abstracted away like the speculative gambling aspect of this, let's say tomorrow you could snap your fingers and you could say, okay, we're going to make it so you can make no speculative money where people have wild swings and their their life savings or any of that. That's all gone tomorrow. I bet you like 99% of the traffic of these systems would probably fall because no one can sit there and just like, take money from retail anymore. They have to actually build the utility. Um, the statement is, well, I need some token to pay for things. Well, in our model with Web5, you would have a DID and a DWeb node. You could host your own DWeb node. You don't need any tokens to be able to host a desktop machine at your house that you already have an internet connection to. That doesn't require any tokens. You might be paying Comcast, for instance, in a token called the US dollar, for instance, which is still a completely valid token for now, even though I don't like it as much, right? It's valid. Or through a credit card. Or you might pay through a more advanced token called SATS, right? If you really wanted to pay, and Verizon accepted it or Comcast accepted it, you could pay in SATS. Why do I need Solana, right? Like, where does that enter the equation for apps that are not these financial gambling apps that have to be done on a smart contract? And the vast majority of apps are those types, are apps that don't need to be done in smart contracts. Like if you're doing decentralized social media or video sharing or any of these things, you don't need a smart contract for that. You need to be able to go where the content resides. You need to be able to pay somehow, right? Not in a special utility token, just pay and then do something with that content or whatever you purchased. And so
And
we
what's
believe,
interesting?
yeah,
Yeah,
go ahead.
go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
So we believe what that could look like in the future is say you have a DWeb node and you like want to go to a creator or someone's, a DWeb node and there's a paid piece of content. Well, they could put up a 402 payment required, and they could say, hey, this costs this many sats to do this thing that you want to do or see this content. And you're like, great, I'll pay you sats. So you hit accept and the sats get sent kind of in a parallel track to them. They get the money, right? Or maybe they charge credit card. Who cares? It doesn't really matter. And then you get access to that content. None of that required some special blockchain. Bitcoin's enough. Bitcoin is, and it's enough.
I'm just trying to unmute that. So now we're at a place where we have a native token of the internet. We have Bitcoin. We have a way to store things. One thing you mentioned, and I think it's interesting, and the DIDs. So one thing you mentioned is most apps don't need a blockchain. And I do fundamentally agree with that. I think blockchains are highly inefficient. If you look at the total number of apps out there, like this to me is like an obvious technical pattern. The argument on the crypto side is there's no incentive. So the question is, how do you create an incentive in this world if you can't print money, aka print tokens out of thin air?
Well, I think most people, so the interesting thing is people have incentives to do normal, ordinary business and life things that they just want to do. Like the incentive for me to tweet is the incentive for Twitter to host tweets is because they want to make ad revenue. I don't technically think if ads were done right, they don't have to track you and be super invasive. Like you could have ad revenue still in the decentralized world where like an app shows very privacy preserving ads like on your phone. And that's how they offset maybe the few developers that work on that nice UI you're using, right? Doesn't mean like ads have to go out the window. The reason why they say tokenomics matters is because someone's got to like maintain the data, right? Like if I post tweets, like the tweets have to be stored somewhere. Well, the cool thing with DWeb nodes is I could store them myself, like at home on a desktop machine that's up all the time. I could have a host store them that derives value from other things. Like I'll give you an example, right? ML and AI systems like to train on highly structured data. They derive value by training on data. That's how like Dolly and like Tree and all of these systems train their models so that they have better and better ML and AI systems. And it's really important for them that the data be, when I say structured, be they know what type it is and they know what format it's in. That way the machines can learn. Now, I don't have a problem with this personally because it's public. Like if I publicly post a tweet on Twitter, anyone can read it. I'm not changing the model if I store it in my own DWeb node that might be hosted by, say, some company and they run an ML model over it. I mean, anyone on the internet can see it. It's the whole point of tweets. It's not like they're getting my private or encrypted data. And if they can generate some like business intelligence for themselves and hone their tools that are used for orthogonal purposes, as they could today anyway, then they might be willing to host my tweets and host some of my content. So I think there's these symbiotic relationships that are natural organic business value where someone is willing to host your content and they don't need like some speculative token that you're pumping for them to extract value out of. It can just be for real direct value relationships that these things take
And
place.
and the and to layer on top of that, the interesting thing is because we have Bitcoin, particularly why we have Lightning and why Zion decided to build on the Lightning network, is that now these micro transactions that may be one as little as one sat, which is 1/100 million of a Bitcoin, can move across from two different people with very little fees if the topology is right. Like to me, that's a very interesting layer to this. So now we have the identity layer, we have the data storage and potentially the messaging piece layer. Now let's talk about the money. You're a Bitcoiner. You're a Bitcoiner at your core, and you do all these amazing things. Why is Bitcoin so important to the stack?
Yeah, I mean, you definitely want to have the ability to pay people for a whole range of things. If it's a creator, there might be content specific to people who pay for that information. If you're a business, you might want to gate certain, aspects of content or business level interactions, services you're delivering, which you can deliver through these DWeb nodes by payment, right? The reason why you want as a business maybe to move to a system that is final, like Sats, sending Sats is because you get all these great benefits. You have like no net 30 and like 90-day, sort of intervals where you get paid. So for them, it's really important. The other one is you would prefer a payment system if it's digital to be digitally native, settlable instantly, like I said, and any denomination of value. Because if you did like an API call to like say some business that you're buying a service for, and it goes through their DWeb node, maybe that API call, it doesn't justify spending like putting $100 out there in some deposit. Like you just want to pay for the API call, which might be like 1 penny. We just don't have a really good way of paying 1 penny without these really established, highly KYC business relationships where like I have like a credit card on file and stuff like that. So Bitcoin gives us the ability to pay incredibly small amounts for exactly what we're doing directly to the creators, directly to the businesses. And that's why they're a perfect match for these DWeb nodes, right? Because you have your content, your activity, and you have the way to gate payment in a more modern fashion.
And so now we've kind of come to the conclusion of we have all these amazing services. Now Zion is building in all this stuff. One of the questions I get a lot is like, why is this taking so long, right? Like why is building in these like technical patterns taking a long time? Could you talk a little bit about how technically innovative some of the things are? Like why this stuff is like really bleeding edge, I guess. Like some of the stuff hasn't been produced at scale yet. Some of it's first to market patterns. Because some of the people here are members that have been patiently waiting. We thought we'd have something in April, May, June. Now we're in October. Why is it so challenging to build this new way? And what's like a proxy that people can think about? It's like, oh yeah, we're building it because we're building it this way for this reason. Why is it so hard? Why is it so important?
Yeah, so there's a few technical reasons. To be able to build a system that has the full range of capabilities that you would need to sort of replicate what centralized systems pull off because they have the rabbit in the hat. They don't have any sort of interdiction resistance or any of these things to protect you, is really hard. So one of those things is like, hey, like making sure that my data is replicated to my devices, to like the host that I might use for the public portions of that data. Replication protocols have been out there for a while, like there's CouchDB, but they're sort of beholden to like a master server, as it were. So creating these more modern systems or integrating them with things like permissioning, where I could, one really interesting concept is, I'll give you an example. Um, when you're dealing with identity data, you might be dealing with medical data. And you come into these scenarios where maybe I give my general practitioner the ability to do stuff, like permission to do stuff, right? But what happens when I'm like out, like, I don't know, got hit on the head, I'm in the hospital. How does my general practitioner delegate authority to a specialist at the hospital to see this data that I want generally to be very private and encrypted? Solving the problem of delegatable permissions and applying it to um, these systems is really tough. So we're just like, to do this right, you're having to solve a lot of things that centralized systems get for free because they invade your privacy, they make singular assumptions, they don't have any defense against like, you getting shut down. So of course it's simpler, right? And it is taking a while. And we're also doing it as a standard. There's a lot of other companies, some in this, even this space of like decentralized personal storage, that are kind of really just building products, right? They're building products that they, essentially it's
Can
like
you
their devs
can
and
you
that's
give an
it.
example? Can you give an example of that?
Well, I don't want to throw anyone under the bus, I kind of, I think there's lots of people who are doing great things and they're taking a different approach, and I don't want to belittle that in any way. It's just a
Yeah,
different
no,
approach.
no one's asking you to belittle it. I'm more curious for my own education. Like, what's the difference between someone building a product and then your approach in building a standard? Like what,
Yeah.
why is that important for
Okay,
for a regular
I'll just
person?
talk. I'll talk in the abstract. There's a lot of companies in this space that some of them are completely even private. They haven't even let source code out yet, but some are doing it open source. Like let's say you run into someone that says I have this great open source software. Well, open source just means that they publish the source code and that you can use it and you're not going to get sued. That's all open source means. It's not any more magical than that. Um, and it doesn't mean that you could even maybe commit to the source code. Committing to open source is like if they allow you, right? Can you write in stuff to that source code? Who knows, right? Different question. Another one is like, is the roadmap yours to sort of have like a big say in, or is it really just a company that's sort of executing their roadmap and then they happen to publish the code to open source? So a lot of companies in the space are doing that. They sort of have their own product roadmap and they happen to expose to you these bits that they call open source, and they're saying that's going to be the new web. And from my experience, it's really hard to convince the whole web to change when you're like a 10-person company and you're just like you have your own private meetings as a company, and then like you happen to publish some open
Yeah,
source code and you're like, here web, billions of people, like I've just done it. See, it's here. Like that's not how the web
and
came to be, right?
and so what how much does the market define this, right? Like how much, because some of the arguments are that the market will define the standard, not the standards process that will define the standard. So how much does the market define it? And like in the history, let's go back a little bit to why standards became successful. Was it a proxy of this process or was it a proxy of something else?
I think I think the process itself, it had to be established. So Tim Berners-Lee helped create the W3C, the guy who essentially created the World Wide Web through the 90s, right? It was worked on. Browser vendors sprung up. Like there was a bunch of different browsers that didn't interoperate at first, so you couldn't like render the same web page. It became this coordination problem. So they had a natural problem where they're like, man, I can't singularly convince anyone to just write web pages and experiences from my browser alone. And so they felt the need. They're like, we would all win more if we all had standards and could all like render a wider web. So they came together in this group and said, okay, yes, we're competitors, but we can compete better and grow the net pie. Oops, sorry, I don't know if it's still going.
It just went to a black screen for a second.
Yeah, let me just. Okay, there we go. So even the is it back?
It's back, just a little blurry.
Okay, that's okay. Went to this blur mode. It thinks I'm part of the background now,
It
unfortunately.
thinks you're it thinks you're in the background.
I don't know how to
It's,
undo it, but okay. I could
uh,
just be like, this is my pseudonymous identity. You know exactly who I
whoa, this is like
am.
when Gigi's on some
Yeah.
sort of a thing.
So
Okay,
I'll lean
love
in,
that.
and everyone can like adjust their own. Um,
That's funny.
but all the
Maybe
browser
Pavel, we could put a
vendors,
filter.
yeah,
Yeah, go ahead.
filter on
You're
it.
on browser vendors. Yeah, go ahead.
So all the browser vendors basically came together and said, hey, we're all going to win more if we web pages and experiences, and they did. Right, the natural organic business process and the desire to have one industry came together, and it's kind of grown in strength. Like it's very hard to get anything into the web of today if you don't go through this process. It's very, very difficult because the browser vendors are looking at these processes that take a long time. I mean, they take years sometimes. Um, Sort of as the gladiator arena of a piece of technology going through so many eyeballs, thousands of eyeballs from hundreds of companies who are pouring their life into making a spec that is being tested daily, right? By every assumption from every angle, right? And that's the difference with a standard. If you have a company that has 10 people in a room and they have private meetings and they decide on what's best for the tech and they say, this is the web, you're getting 10 eyeballs with probably one relatively, succinct focus that's targeted at their use cases. And that's the lens they're going to see the world through. In a standards arena, you're getting thousands of eyeballs from hundreds of companies consistently for a couple of years who are
And
all
the biggest
saying,
companies in
oh,
the world.
exactly. And I don't think that we're going to magically like upend literally all of them. Would I care if that happened? No, I wouldn't. But practically speaking, yeah, I don't think Google's going to zero anymore. I don't believe it. So I think we probably have to work with them instead
Yeah,
of
I don't
fully
think people
against them.
know the power of these systems. Like this like shadowy supercoder in some random country is not going to beat Google like anytime soon. I just don't think it's possible because their scale is so immense and they have so much power. Let alone we got you back and then it went blurry again.
Yeah.
There we go.
Oh, there we go.
Bang bang,
Sorry.
we fixed it. So no, I agree with you, and I think that's the interesting difference here. But one thing I also want to maybe talk a little bit about what's interesting about this DWN infrastructure is that it doesn't provide just open source. It also provides a ability for open state. I think this is what something that's I think people don't really understand is that a lot of people are like, oh, it's open source, fine. Just because you can see the code doesn't mean you actually know what's happening underneath the hood. And what's interesting is DWeb nodes seem to have this ability of not just that it's open source as the code is open source, but the functions allow for open state. And I think that's the difference of even what's happened with Bitcoin. Like, why is Bitcoin so important? Is that it's not just the fact that it's an open source decentralized monetary network, is that the state of the network can be written by any individual and no government entity has read or write privileges at the root access level. Every individual has open state accesses at the root access level. So I
Exactly.
think that's an interesting narrative to go down.
Yeah, so this is one interesting thing about DIDs themselves. You can implement a DID in many ways. Ion is but one of those ways, a layer two on Bitcoin, but that you can do it. Some DID methods are very simplistic. Ion has this sort of capability that very few actually have, which is the ability to have to crawl essentially the DID substrate. And when I say like the DID substrate, I mean like think about a telephone book, right? A white pages. Back in the day, we used to have all these people's names, random names, and we had their phone number. And you could like, if you wanted to, I guess you could start from A and you could just call them all, right? And you could ask them a question. You could like ring their phone number and say, "Hey, do you like the color green?" Right? You could do that. Now think about Ion as sort of white pages, but you don't know the person's name. It's just pseudonymous, like big ugly string. And then you have this way that you can call them, right? You could go through every ID and you could ask them a question. You could say, "Hey, you got any tweets? Hey, do you have any secondhand sales items like Craigslist that I would visualize in sort of a buying experience? Do you have any of that?" And they don't have to answer you. They could tell you, "Screw off, man. I'm pseudonymous and being very private. I don't want to even let you know what's behind this segment." But a lot of them probably want to tell you some stuff. Like they probably want to tell you their tweets. They probably want to tell you they have a couch for sale or a car or something like that, right? Um, so what it allows you to do when you talk about open state, anyone can create an ID on Ion. Anyone can link it to a D-Web node with content. And then you could build these sort of decentralized crawlers that can go through and call everyone, say, hey, do you have anything you want to tell me? And then you get this open world sort of almost like market, right? Like I think that maybe Open Bazaar was just early. It might have just been early. Brian over there,
What is
works at
Open Bazaar?
yeah, Brian Hoffman. He initially tried to do or digital, yeah, Open Bazaar. I think it was Open Bazaar. Shit. He's the early Bitcoiner. He kind of went into big block stuff for a point. I think he's maybe not doing that anymore. But he's an early Bitcoiner, and they tried to do a decentralized sort of market for secondhand goods and sales of goods. And it was it just didn't have the right capabilities. But I think we do now, right? To be able to publish to a substrate, no one can stand in the middle of your ID or the connection to get that data. You could think about what you could do. You could do almost anything with it, right?
I mean, every time, I don't know, every time we talk, I mean, by the way, Daniel was here about a month and a half ago in my living room and mesmerizing 10 Bitcoiners around our dinner table about this stuff. But every time we talk, I get so encouraged about where we're going, what we're doing together. I want to thank you. Before we wrap, is there anything particular you'd like to share? I know we have probably like 2 more minutes left about kind of you guys, Block, what you guys are doing over there, why this work is so important, how people can find you, and yeah.
Absolutely. So Block, I'm laser focused on this Web5 platform, which is DIDs, verifiable credentials, and decentralized web nodes. We can help people build decentralized web apps like Zion. This is open source work that's mainly based on standards from Decentralized Identity Foundation and the W3C, World Wide Web Consortium. I'd encourage you to become a member or a participant in those ecosystems if you want to have influence over the standards. The cool thing is, unlike a company, you can jump on the phone with everyone talking about these technologies and you can influence them. And that's the beauty of it, right? And also check out TBD. It's the business unit in Block that I work under, that Jack and others have sponsored within that company. And that's where we're doing implementation. So if you want to go on GitHub, it's like TBD and a bunch of numbers I can't remember off the top of my head that our Twitter account's under. And yeah, just come hang out and be open source with us.
And I really appreciate that. And what I'll kind of allude to in wrap is that, Zion, I made a decision as the CEO and the founder when I met Daniel that we were going all in on this pattern. We're going all in on DIDs. We're building an implementation of decentralized web nodes that we can bring to you by October. We're building in these storage patterns because I believe in my heart this is how the internet should have worked. And we're building a Lightning wallet natively to all of those protocols. So every single thing gets paid through a Lightning wallet as well. I think this is how the internet should work. And I'm very, very hopeful, and I'm spending all my life force energy. You're spending all your life force energy on this. And we're so thankful for everyone listening to this call because you're all members of Zion. You're part of this community. We're really stoked to bring this to life. And I feel like this is like a conversation people had probably in the 80s about the internet. I think it's but this is for applications. I think that's where we are. And it's, to me, what an exciting time to be part of these early conversations that will be standards that we all use for the world. So I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you, everyone, for our third AMA. We have a really exciting guest coming up next week. We'll be announcing that shortly. Bang, bang. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.